Professor Daniel Eastman An to deliver a lecture titled The Cross in Asia. Professor An received his PhD in early Christianity from Yale University in the United States and currently serves as Professor of Church History at the United Graduate School of Theology here at Yonsei University.
The presentation today has two parts. In the first part, I cover a chronological story from the 1st to the 4th centuries. And in the second part, I look at a more thematic approach of different iconographies and understandings of the cross that have emerged and developed in Asia over time. Finally, I will offer some concluding thoughts and reflections on the status of crosses today. My focus today is on crosses in Asia in the first 8 centuries after Christ, and I will be focusing mostly on Western Asia in this period, or what is sometimes called, from a Eurocentric perspective, the Middle East. As we know from the Acts of the Apostles, some of the earliest Christian communities were established in the area of Asia Minor, or modern Turkey. In broad terms, we can think of the Christian missions in the first 3 centuries as proceeding in 2 directions, both geographically and linguistically. On the one hand, Greek-speaking Jews and Christians spread the gospel southward and westward across the Mediterranean world and the Roman Empire. During this process, the Christian scriptures were gradually translated from Greek into Latin, Latin being the language of the Romans. At the same time, Greek and Aramaic-speaking Jews and Christians were spreading the gospel eastward, toward the eastern borders of the Roman Empire and beyond into the neighboring Persian Empire. During the same period, the Christian scriptures were being translated from Greek into Syriac, Syriac being a dialect of Aramaic that was spoken and written around the city of Edessa. From the 3rd century onward, Christianity seems to have spread gradually across Mesopotamia and into Central Asia. In the year 410, the Christians in the Persian Empire had their first major church council at the Persian capital of Seleucia. And this council was attended by bishops from as far away as Merv in what's now Turkmenistan. Subsequently, these Christians continued to send missionaries eastward by land and by sea. By the 6th century, there were well-established Christian communities along the coast of India and in Sri Lanka, and at various points along the Silk Road, going east. By the middle of the 7th century, when the first Muslim armies came north from Arabia and conquered this area, Christian missionaries from Persia had already reached China and begun to establish Christian monasteries there. So in other words, within the first 7 centuries after Christ, there were already Christians living in most parts of Asia. For several reasons, the very brief history that I've just laid out is not well known by most Christians in the world today. One reason for that is, of course, that the majority of Christians today belong to traditions that trace their history through Europe rather than through Asia, and that includes most Christians in Asia today. Another important reason is that the majority of Christians in Asia in the past, and to an extent today, lived as minorities under non-Christian rule, and as a result, did not leave an enduring historical footprint for historians to later discover. In fact, much of what we know about the early spread of Christianity across Asia comes from the writings of bishops and monks living in monasteries in Western Asia. We can think of monasteries as treasuries of Christian historical memory. However, even in the absence of written sources, there is one other type of source that alerts us to the presence of Christians in the historical record. Can anyone guess what that might be? Crosses. Yes, wherever Christians went in Asia, they brought and made crosses. The question is, can the form of the cross tell us anything about the Christians who made and used it? To answer this question, I'd like to go back to the beginnings of the cross as a Christian sign. When we look at the first 300 years after Christ, there's very little evidence for physical crosses playing a central role in Christian faith and practice. Instead, the earliest Christian visual art seems to have been a mix of biblical scenes and motifs taken over from pagan, non-Christian art, such as the shepherd and the orant figure. At the same time, there is a lack of clear descriptions of physical crosses by Christian writers in the first 300 years after Christ. Christians talk about the cross in abstract terms. For example, Justin Martyr notes that the form of the cross can be seen in non-Christian visual culture, such as Roman battle standards. But these writers do not talk about actual physical crosses being used in Christian prayer and worship. Why not? Traditionally, scholars have given two reasons for the relative lack of crosses in Christian life during this period. First, in at least sometimes in places during the first 300 years, publicly identifying oneself as a Christian could have negative consequences. These consequences ranged from social, political, and economic disadvantages to persecution and even death. Therefore, scholars have argued it's not surprising that Christians did not try to distinguish themselves through special visual signs like crosses. In fact, it's been argued that Christians would have avoided drawing attention to crosses in particular because crosses were associated with one of the most shameful methods of execution in the Roman Empire, crucifixion. And here I should note that crucifixion did not stop with Jesus. It continued as a means of punishing criminals under Roman rule, especially criminals who were slaves and non-citizens. In this context, it seems plausible that many Christians would not have wanted to adopt this symbol. And here, for comparison, I will make a modern comparison. I know an American priest who used to wear an electric chair around his neck. Why? Because electric chairs are associated with execution in the US. So we could imagine that wearing a cross in the Roman Empire would have been like wearing an electric chair in the US. Not everybody would want to do that. Not all Christians would want to do that. One ancient example of the possible shame of the cross is this graffito found scratched on the wall of a building excavated in Rome on the Palatine Hill. The graffito shows a man standing before a figure with a donkey's head on a cross. Oops. Man here. The caption reads, Alexamenos, this guy, worships God, this figure. It seems to be a mocking caricature of Christian piety. That is, the author of this graffito is making fun of a Christian named Alexamenos for worshiping a crucified criminal. But just because a non-Christian knew about the crucifixion of Christ does not mean that the cross was being used in Christian prayer. Let's look at some more examples. Aside from the graffito that we just saw, this gem is the earliest known depiction of the crucifixion of Christ. It shows a naked, bearded, and long-haired figure attached to a tau cross, a T-shaped cross. Around the figure and on the back of the gem is a Greek inscription. The inscription starts with the words, Son, Father, Jesus Christ, followed by a string of indecipherable syllables. Scholars have taken this to be a form of magical spell, meant to protect the user or wearer of the gem. We don't know whether this gem belonged to a Christian or simply someone who heard that the name of the crucified Christ had power. Think of the story in Acts 4:10 when Peter heals a crippled man in the name of Christ crucified. The strongest evidence, probably, for the existence of physical crosses in Christian worship comes from a Christian writer named Tertullian, who was writing from North Africa. Tertullian wrote several works defending Christianity against pagan, non-Christian critiques. In two of these works, he addresses the pagan critique that Christians worship the cross. He says, "Whoever calls us priests of the cross will be our fellow priest. The cross is by nature a wooden symbol. So too with you, that is, you non-Christians. You worship a material image, that is, a statue. But whereas yours is a human figure, ours is unique in itself." So Tertullian's idea is that Christians are accused of worshiping wooden crosses, and pagans are doing the same thing because they worship a statue, and the statue is made out of a wooden cross with things on it. Is this evidence for the use of wooden crosses in Christian worship? Maybe. Tertullian appears to affirm that Christians worship the cross, but we don't know what that means in practice, and we also don't know if he's being serious. It's difficult to say because Tertullian is a very sarcastic writer. It might be saying the opposite of what he means. One more example. This comes from the Acts of John, which is an apocryphal text that most scholars think was composed in Syria in the late 2nd century. This text describes the disciple John hiding in a cave on the Mount of Olives at the same time that Jesus was crucified. Suddenly, right at the moment of the crucifixion, Christ appears to John in the cave in the form of a cross of light. And he delivers this long speech to John explaining the meaning of the cross of light, which I'm not going to read now, but it seems that for the author of this text, the cross of light is a kind of mysterious cosmic sign that is only visible to and understandable by certain special Christians, namely what scholars today call Gnostic Christians. Here the cross is explicitly not about the crucifixion of Christ, but rather about mystical knowledge. This text tells us that there was still a lot of variation across communities about the meaning of the cross and of Christ in the 3rd century. So to sum up, some takeaways in the first 3 centuries. First, the crucifixion of Christ was well known among both Christians and non-Christians. Second, the cross was identified by some Christians as an abstract symbol with potentially cosmic significance. And this is not just Gnostics, this is other Christians as well. Third, wooden crosses may have been present in some Christian communities. And fourth, crosses were probably not a central visual presence for most Christians. All right, this brings us to Constantine. Constantine was the first Roman emperor to explicitly endorse Christianity. During his long reign, he died in 337, several events happened that set the stage for crosses to become the central visual symbol of Christianity. First, early in his reign, in 312, Constantine adopted a cross-shaped sign as his battle standard. We don't know exactly what this sign looked like, but according to a later source, which you can see here, it looks like a battle standard, which is already a cross shape, with the first 2 letters of Christ's name on the top, Chi Rho. So possibly something like this here from a late coin from Constantine. You can see the Chi Rho on the top there. But there are different variations. Second, after Constantine became sole emperor, he ended the persecution of Christians under Roman rule. Suddenly it became much more public and much more visible being a Christian, and that might include crosses also. Third, Constantine put an end to crucifixion as a method of executing criminals. So after Constantine, people in the Roman Empire would no longer see criminals hanging on crosses. That might change how people think about that symbol. And maybe most importantly, at the end of his reign, Constantine, or maybe his mother, Helena, undertook a building campaign in Jerusalem during which the tomb of Christ was discovered, and also the wooden cross on which Christ was crucified, the true cross. Very quickly, Christians from around the empire started coming to Jerusalem to visit the tomb and the cross of Christ. Our earliest example of this pilgrimage to the cross is from a Spanish pilgrim named Egeria in the early 380s. And she visited Jerusalem during Holy Week. She gives a description here of what happens on Good Friday of Holy Week, which I will not read, but at the end of this you can see she's describing what happens. There's a bishop who is holding a relic of the wood of the true cross, and there are deacons on both sides, and the pilgrims are coming up, and they are kissing the wood of the cross and then moving on. She says that they do that, or they have guards, because on one occasion, I don't know when, one of them bit off a piece of the holy wood and stole it away. And for this reason, the deacons stand around and keep watch in case anyone else does the same. So you can get an idea of the level of devotion and excitement that the true cross evoked among pilgrims. But what could you do if you could not bite off a piece of the true cross? Well, instead you could buy a souvenir or a replica cross and take it back home with you, and that's what people did. The events of Constantine's reign had a profound impact on the spread of cross imagery throughout West Asia and beyond. Suddenly, crosses began to feature on the empire's battle standards, on the empire's coins, on souvenirs from Jerusalem, in the churches that Christians started to build, and in liturgical celebrations, which were now held publicly in the streets, with processional crosses. Today, just a few examples. This is the beginning of the central place of the cross in Christianity, which continues until today. However, as you might have noticed, there was already great variation in the sizes, shapes, contexts, uses, and indeed meanings of crosses. So I want to now look at three overlapping understandings of crosses that developed during and after this period among Christians in Asia. First, the cross was seen as a trophy, or tropion in Greek, of the victory of Christ over death. Since Roman emperors from Constantine onward adopted the cross as a battle standard and a sign of imperial power, the cross became associated with that power also. That is, the victory of Christ over death and the powers of evil was connected to Roman and later Byzantine military victory. Crosses on imperial coinage are clearly meant to be understood this way. For example, you can see here the world with the cross over it being held by the Byzantine empress. Another way to emphasize the cross as a trophy of victory was to cover it with gold and gemstones, or at least to show it covered with gold and gemstones. For example, on the left here is a mosaic cross on the ceiling of the church sanctuary at Mor Gabriel Monastery in what's now Turkey. The mosaic was made in the 6th century, probably with money sent by the Byzantine emperor. This is certainly not the cross of the crucifixion, but it could be seen as a trophy of Christ's victory. Or, another way to see this cross is as an eschatological cross. That is, this is the sign of the parousia, the second coming of Christ. Remember the text of Matthew 24:30. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Most early Christians thought that sign was a cross. The victorious cross could also be much smaller. For example, on the left here is a small metal cross from Al-Hira in modern Iraq. This cross probably dates to the 6th to 8th centuries and was worn around the neck, so by a Christian living under Persian or Muslim rule. You can see the circles on the surface of the cross. These may be meant to represent gemstones. Art historians call this kind of cross an apotropaic cross, that is, it protects the wearer against harm. So here there's again, conflation between Christ's victory over sin and death and the powers of evil, and the same iconography of the cross being adopted by Byzantine rulers. Both could be happening in different contexts. And you can see that also here on this side, very common inscription with the cross, Jesus Christ conquers. Here it is on a Byzantine coin associated with Byzantine victory. And here it is on a modern ring, associated more with personal protection. But what about the cross of the crucifixion? How did people represent that? Well, the most obvious way would be with wooden crosses. I know of no examples of physical surviving wooden crosses from Asia in the first millennium, but we have plenty of stories about them. This is probably the earliest one. This is from a text from the late 4th century called The Seven Martyrs of Samosata. At the beginning of this text, 2 Christian men named Hyperechius and Philotheus are praying toward a cross on the eastern wall of a private room in their house. As they are praying, 5 younger men who are not Christians discover them and ask them what they are doing. Here our text begins. Hyperechius and Philotheus answered, "As for us, we are praying to the one who set in order heaven and earth in his wisdom." The 5 visitors responded, "What is this wooden cross for? Did it make heaven and earth that you worship it?" Hyperechius and Philotheus answered, "The one who was crucified upon a wooden cross, he it is whom we worship." Sounds very familiar to us today, but at that time it was new. This is probably the earliest definite evidence for Christians praying toward a physical cross. It's therefore significant that the cross appears to be a simple wooden cross, that it is not the cross of the vision of Constantine, it's not the cross of the victorious imperial armies, it's not even the cross of Christ's second coming. Those meanings could be there too, but the emphasis is on the crucifixion. What about visual depictions of Christ's crucifixion? In fact, these are not common in Asia outside of the Byzantine Empire. We have a few examples of narrative scenes that show the crucifixion of Christ, like the Bula Gospels over here from Syria, and this gilt plate with the scene of the crucifixion that was found in central Russia. But we don't have any examples of crucifixes, like this one in the middle. This is actually from the Byzantine Empire, not further east. However, that does not mean that Christians in Asia could not imagine Christ crucified. In fact, they did. The earliest examples in the history of Christianity of so-called affective piety, that is, imagining Christ on the cross while praying, come from West Asia, like this example from Rasa Prasada, who imagines Christ while he's praying. Most Western histories of Christianity have described this kind of crucifixion-centered piety as arising much later, in the 11th and 12th centuries in Western Europe. But in fact, it's already present in Asia in the 7th and 8th centuries. Finally, the last major theme that I want to look at today is the cross as a source of life. The clearest expression of this theme portrays the cross as the tree of life from the Garden of Eden. We can find this already hinted at in the 2nd century in Justin Martyr, but it's further developed by later Syriac writers. For example, a text called the Cave of Treasures lays out a parallel narrative between Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and Christ Christ on the cross. I'll quote the first part. That tree of life that was in the middle of paradise prefigured the redeeming cross, which is the true tree of life. And this is what was fixed in the middle of the earth being Jerusalem. We can find the same idea of the cross as the tree of life in iconography. That is, either the cross itself is shown as tree-like or growing, as in this pyx here. The pyx is a container for the Eucharistic elements. Or the cross is shown as here with the 4 rivers of paradise coming out from its base. Here, rather stylistic. Yeah. Some examples are more abstract. You can see a few more examples of crosses with vegetal or plant-like iconography here. Notice the geographic and temporal breadth of these examples. These are coming from across Asia in medieval times. And in some cases, the iconography of the cross itself is more ambiguous, but the accompanying text shows that the cross is meant to be seen primarily as a source of life. As in these examples from Western and Central Asia, here we have literally sign of life written in Syriac on both sides of the cross. And here we have a cross on a scrap of parchment from Central Asia with the text, "For your servant girl, healing," being sent to someone for healing. I'd like to conclude with a few examples showing cross iconography adapting to various settings in Asia and the mixing of different visual motifs that occurs. For example, Persian art used the motif of symmetrical spread wings or ribbons to glorify the object between the wings, or simply for decoration, as you can see in the middle here. Christians then adopted this visual motif from their environment and applied it to the cross. As you can see from this example from Armenia, this example from the Persian Gulf, down at the bottom. We can also trace continuities in cross iconography across very large distances. Notice how the Mylapore cross on the right, from the east coast of India, incorporates elements from crosses in West Asia. This makes sense since early Christians in India were part of the same ecclesial structure as Christians in Western Asia and were in communication with it. Final example, crosses from China show both continuities and local adaptations. The flared arms and pearls on these crosses are typical of nearly all Asian crosses, but the lotus flower base and the apsara, or angelic figures here, are borrowings from Chinese and Indian art, or you might say from Hindu and Buddhist art. The application of these motifs to the cross shows how flexible its iconography can be. The basic form of the cross remains, but its specific iconography can be adapted almost endlessly. I'd like to conclude with some notes of caution. First, we should remember that iconography alone does not determine meaning. Think of the example of Yosef Hosea envisioning Christ on the cross crucified, even though he was probably not looking at a crucifix. We can only guess at how crosses were seen and experienced by Christians in the past, and sometimes we might be wrong. And second, iconographic types are second-order categories. That is, Christians 1,000 years ago did not look at a cross and say, "Oh, that's a victorious cross," or "Oh, that's a life-giving cross." These meanings were subsumed under the simple category of cross. That said, I think it's still worthwhile to identify these major themes and how crosses have been understood, as I've tried to do in this presentation, because it helps us to reflect on what Christians in different times and places wanted to emphasize about Christ, about who Christ was for them. And that's what I mean by saying the cross is an index of Christ's relationship with humanity. Today, Christians continue to express their understanding of Christ and Christianity through the image of the cross, sometimes in new and creative ways, as these examples from Korea show. My hope is that by understanding the history of the cross in Asia, we can better appreciate its richness as a stable, but also ever-evolving symbol of Christianity. Thank you.